The spring anime season is slowly coming to an end as many shows will be wrapping up in the next couple of weeks. One of the best new shows to premiere this season was The Executioner and Her Way of Life, an isekai series from JC Staff based on a light novel by Mato Sato. There are many isekai series that premiere each season, but this is one of those rare shows in which the author does something unique with its story and world that makes their work stand out amongst the plethora of generic adaptations we usually get. As I mentioned before in a previous video, this anime was one of my most anticipated shows for this year after reading the first volume of the manga. After rewatching the show last week and viewing the season finale, I'm happy to say that this show didn't disappoint. The Executioner and Her Way of Life is a terrific isekai series with a great premise and a well-written story that is entertaining from start to finish. For those unaware, this show takes place in a fantasy world where people being summoned from a different world is commonplace. Strangely, these otherworlders always come from Japan and are usually referred to as Lost Ones. The Lost Ones are executed in secret by the church because of the potential threat their abilities pose to the world. These abilities, referred to as pure concepts, have been a source of great calamity in the past, hence why this power is considered taboo and these individuals are disposed of by priests serving as executioners. This anime is centered on an executioner named Minnow and a lost one named Akari, whose pure concept of time makes her hard to kill. After her initial attempt to assassinate Akari fails, Minnow begins traveling with her in hopes of finding a way to successfully end her target's life. Along their journey, Minnow continues to deceive Akari as to her true objective, while Akari's affection for her grows as they spend time together. As the story progresses, Minnow's resolve to fulfill her duty begins to slowly deteriorate as a result of being with Akari for an extended period of time. It becomes more imperative that she acquires the means to kill Akari after certain events occur along the way. The show begins with the introduction of a lost one summoned by Kingri Surika named Mitsuki Matoi. Sato uses this character to not only subvert expectations, but to also demonstrate how potentially dangerous people with pure concepts could be. Mitsuki is a very minor character that the author also utilizes as an excuse to have Minnow briefly explain different aspects of her world to in a way that seems natural. When the show decides to introduce new concepts, the explanations are usually brief. One of the best aspects of this series is its unique fantasy world influenced by Japan and its intriguing lore. Sato deserves a lot of praise for how unique and rich the world he crafted is. Within the first few episodes, there's a lot of different elements presented to the audience, such as the 3 social classes, ether weapons, magecraft materials, scriptures, and the catastrophes that happened long ago known as the 4 human errors. Otherworlders have had such a big impact on the world and its culture to the point that some places tend to look much more modern compared to other isekai worlds. This influence from the Lost Ones likely extends to how the scriptures the priestess use function and how ether is used to perform magecraft. Scriptures are utilized not only for magecraft, but also to communicate over long distances or even take pictures, making them comparable to smartphones, albeit with way less functionality. Magecraft is this show's equivalent to magic, but is described as a type of technology used to manipulate ether. This distinction, as well as how restrictive and uncommon magecraft usage is just another among many factors that makes the world unique. The lore gets really interesting later on in the season when stuff like the origins of demons, monsters, and Sin Magecraft is introduced. The narrative moves along at a nice pace with a few episodes dedicated to setting things up, introducing new characters, and world building. These episodes don't have much action in them, but the content that's there is still very engaging. It's also worth mentioning that these episodes occur prior to major conflicts and are spaced out enough so that the show doesn't feel like it's slowing down. The story is tightly written with any potential loose ends addressed by the end of the season. It's no easy feat to write a story containing time manipulation without accidentally leaving plot holes that ruin the quality of the narrative. Sato sets up certain reveals and other things that will occur later on, often through the actions, dialogue, and even behavior of particular characters. The events that happen throughout the season are, for the most part, connected in some way. The way in which different elements introduced throughout the series comes together results in a very cohesive narrative. There are a couple good twists that I didn't see coming, and I ultimately like what the author does with Akari halfway through the season. For over half the show, Minnow has to protect Akari, who's always putting herself in danger out of concern for her. Minnow often sees Akari as a nuisance because of that and her constant disobedience. She might get in the way, but that's just her caring nature. I'm glad that there are moments where Akari gets a bigger role to play in resolving conflicts, and thankfully she is much more proactive during the last several episodes. Akari is a lively, ditzy girl that came off as selfish and entitled in a couple of instances. After coming to Minno's world and meeting her, she wants nothing more than to stay by her side. However, there's a much more interesting aspect to the character that is revealed midway through the season, in which case it's clear what her objective will be going forward. As an executioner, Minno has been trained to deceive her targets in order to get close to them. She usually puts on a benevolent facade in front of Akari. She doesn't relish in killing lost ones, but believes it's necessary in order to prevent another human error disaster. There is a scene in the first episode that conveys this well through the character's internal dialogue and subtle actions. Minno's backstory is fleshed out early on, which is when her master, the main antagonist Flare, is introduced. Minno wants to surpass Flare and take on the burden of killing otherworlders. I like that Sato didn't write the executioners as people delusional enough to believe what they do is righteous or honorable. I love the training flashback scene with Flare and the speech she gives in regards to this. Throughout the season, Minno's aide, a priestess named Momo, follows behind the pair on their journey unbeknownst to Akari. Momo is my favorite character so far, and the author uses her often for comedy relief. She's crazy about Minno and would do anything for her. She reminds me of Kuroko Shirai from A Certain Scientific Railgun in that regard. I'm starting to see this character trope a lot, the lesbian in love with the protagonist who doesn't like her in the same way, but as long as it's tackled effectively in a humorous manner, it doesn't really bother me. If your name ain't Minno, then Momo probably hates you. I can understand why some people might not like this character because of her attitude towards Akari and Princess Knight Ashina. I found the remarks about Akari to be quite amusing, and I love her scenes with Ashina. She's not only jealous of Akari for being able to spend time with Minno, but she's also concerned for Minno's heart. She doesn't want her to suffer the emotional toll of having to kill someone she has spent a significant amount of time with. Usually, whenever Momo's around Minno, she's happy, energetic, and outgoing. However, her mood and attitude completely changes whenever she runs into Ashina. She tends to be rude, cold, dismissive, and even condescending due to Ashina being a princess. The way she acts around her is totally unwarranted, as Ashina is always friendly towards Momo. With that said, I love how Ashina is unshaken by her hostility and harsh remarks. There are some very funny moments with Momo getting annoyed by her. Ashina was another character that I really enjoyed every time Momo happened to cross paths with her. She's very confident in her abilities, always itching for a fight, and is usually in a good mood. Ashina has exceptional intuition and a sense of justice, which leads her to investigate the whereabouts of the lost ones her father summoned, and later on other suspicious activity. There were several antagonists introduced throughout the season that Minno had to deal with. I'm going to be as vague as possible in talking about some of them, since a couple are surprises that I don't want to spoil. The opening sequence practically gives away Flare being the main villain of the series, but thankfully the scene revealing how she's opposing Minno and Akari is still impactful. The reveal of one of the early villains was handled terrifically, as there wasn't a lot of hints beforehand, and it comes shortly after a big revelation. This particular character's motivation for their actions is a personal one, and their justification kinda boils down to entitlement. Minno encounters another villain, Manon LaBelle, when her and Akari stop at the port city of LaBelle. Manon is the ruler of the city and acting leader of a self-proclaimed fourth social class, simply called the Fourth. She has the strongest motivation out of all the villains, but was the weakest in terms of power. Manon and the final antagonist are arguably the most fleshed out villains in the show. There is a flashback with Manon as a child that did make me feel some sympathy toward the character, despite what she does. Moreover, I appreciate that a revenge plot isn't tackled in a simple or predictable way. The introduction of the season's final antagonist is one of the best moments of the series so far. Part of why it's so good from a writing standpoint is due to how Sato kinda misleads the audience in the prior episodes and even hints to this character in Manon's dialogue in a couple scenes. When this character makes their grand appearance, things start to get really crazy. The last 7 minutes of this episode was like something out of a Hideo Kojima game. I can only describe it as a bizarre, horrific spectacle. Suddenly, the show started veering toward the horror genre by the end of the episode. This anime has presented some unsettling and grotesque imagery before in a few scenes, but nothing on the scale of what is shown here. I can't stress enough just how enthralling these scenes were, and the reveal of this character's identity at the end was great. This was the perfect final villain to end the season with, in that this character brings things back full circle, forcing Minno to tackle the same issue she's yet to resolve with Akari. This encounter also reinforces the idea of lost ones being a potential threat to her world, and thus adding a sense of urgency to her mission to kill Akari before her pure concept goes out of control. Minno's battle against this foe was very entertaining and the animation was solid. My only gripe with the action-packed finale was the use of CG throughout the episode. JC staff relies on CG sparingly throughout the series. In most instances it's used briefly, such as with the crowd in the train station scene in episode 2, or with quick shots of the train heading to the city of Garm. The 2D animation is generally very smooth and the action scenes were always exciting, with Minnow utilizing her hidden blade and scripture to fight her enemies. She often uses magecraft in clever ways to get the upper hand on her opponents. Momo and Ashina also have very cool action scenes. There are some awesome action scenes with Momo in episode 6 that showcase just how powerful she is. This show features some fairly bloody and brutal fight sequences, one of which occurs later in the series that surprised me. From the moment I saw the first trailer for this anime, I was impressed by its presentation. I like the artwork and the characters fit well against the backgrounds. The character designs by Keiko Tamaki are unique and just as appealing as the original artwork by Nilitsu. This anime also has an outstanding soundtrack that contains some really diverse tracks. The music was composed by Michiru, who has previously made music for Ascendance of a Bookworm and Given. There are some tracks that help to invoke a sense of wonder that is perfect for this type of series. There are also a couple tracks that are much different from what you would expect to hear from an isekai anime. One of them sounds like techno music and the other has a very western vibe to it. I'm no music expert, but from what I could tell, a variety of instruments were used to create this show's background music. What stood out most to me was the use of the piano in many of the tracks and the use of what sounds like a Mexican guitar. I think a harmonica is used during one of the intermission tracks, which I liked. In addition to the background music, the opening theme, Paper Banquet, performed by artist Millie, is awesome. The lyrics are a perfect fit for this anime. The weakest aspect of this show, in my opinion, is the English dub. This is the second dubcast I've checked out from the High Dive streaming service, and I'm quite dissatisfied with it so far. However, I've grown to appreciate certain performances after rewatching the episodes that have been currently dubbed. It took some time for me to adjust to hearing the other actors since I'm so used to the Japanese performances, which I think were excellent. I thought Melissa Milano is fine as Akari, and often has much better line delivery than Annie Wilde as Minnow. From what I could find online, it appears that she doesn't have a lot of voice acting experience, so I don't want to be too harsh about her performance, but she was definitely the weakest amongst the main cast. There were times where she sounded like she was just reading her lines, and some instances where she was just flat. Wilde doesn't speak with enough emotion when delivering her lines. Catherine Thomas was solid as Momo, and is kind of close to how I'd imagine her sounding. Rachel Messer and Molly Searcy are currently the best out of the main voice cast. Searcy captures the stern and cold disposition of Flair, and Messer is almost perfect as Princess Ashina. The worst bit of voice acting I've heard so far has come from random background characters. There is a little girl that Akari and Minnow meet before boarding the train to Garm that just sounded awful. My biggest issues with the English dub has to do with some minor dialogue changes and the constant mispronunciation of several names. I believe whoever was in charge of directing these actors is the one at fault for the inaccurate pronunciation. I find it hard to believe whoever was in charge actually took a moment to see how different things were said in the Japanese dub. The way they pronounced Faust and Grisurica was annoying to hear. Also, some of the changes they made to the dialogue were unnecessary, like changing the line Minnow and Flair always use from pure just and strong to pure just and powerful. All things considered, The Executioner and Her Way of Life is a refreshing isekai anime that should be celebrated for its well-woven story, distinct world, diverse soundtrack, and unique premise. I highly recommend fans of the fantasy and isekai genres watch this series, especially if you're a fan of Re:Zero. I think fans of that series might enjoy this since they have similar elements and tone. Even if you usually don't like this type of show, it may be worth giving this a shot because of how different its concept is. If you've seen The Executioner and Her Way of Life, let me know what you guys thought about it in the comment section below, and as always, thank you guys for watching. I'm out of here. Peace.